Hi, I'm Rhonda and today I'm going to talk to you about the Riviera Summer Breeze top by Hot Patterns. Before we start to form the drape and sew in the gathers on the top, the next step that we need to do is make the ties. The pattern calls for you to sew the tie so that you have your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then you turn it so that the seam is actually on the edge of the tie. Personally, I don't care for that. I like for the seam to rest in the middle, and the nice way to do that is sew the seam, and then before you do anything else, roll the seam to the center of the tie and sew across the end. When you turn it, you'll end up with a nice crisp edge to your tie. It looks lovely, it lays nice and flat, and I think it makes a very nice finishing detail. Now that we have our ties finished, it's time to move on to the front of the blouse. And the blouse itself is actually quite simple to put together. All of the detail is in the pleat and in the gathering that's here on the side. So here are your two front pieces. And if you look at them, you can think, I have no idea how these go together, because they do look a little wicky-wonky. But it's really very ingenious how she figured this all out. And it all works very well as long as you make sure and mark your notches so that you know exactly where your notches are. The first step that you're going to do is, you can see with this piece, this is the main front piece, you can see a nice little arrow here. This folds over once it's sewn, and that's what forms this little pleat here. So, in here, you can see inside is a seam, and that's the seam that we're going to put together first. If you look at this, you would think that somehow this curve would go to this curve. Not at all. This curve actually goes to this curve here. So you take this piece and match it to here, and here you want to make sure that the notch that is here matches to the seam line, not the edge. If you match it to the edge, you're going to have an issue when it comes to sewing this little gathered area. So we match this notch to this seam line. I'm going to pin in this seam so we can get on to the gathered area. There's a little bit of ease in this, which is nice because remember, this is falling over the bust line, so we would like to have a little bit of ease in this area. It all goes together really quite easily. Once this is pinned, of course you would sew it here. Once this seam is sewn, this is a seam that is much easier to serge the seam than to do a French seam. I wouldn't tell you to do a French seam here. I think you would end up hating me in the process if you tried to do it. It would be a little bit tricky. It'd be much easier just to serge the seam and be done with it. So we have this pinned. Of course, you would sew it just as we had said and serge that seam. Turn this. Now you can begin to see how this is all coming together. Here's the neckline of the blouse. Here's the pleat that will fold over, and it matches to the notch. And here's the notch that you match the pleat to. Now for the area here where all the gathers come in and form this graceful drape over the midriff, we need to put in our gathering stitches along this edge. They come to the notch that's here. Get my thread out of the way. There's my notch. So from the side seam to the notch, and then here in this curved area, there is a notch here and a notch here. So the way I did this is what happens is these gathers will gather up and match to this area between the side seam and this notch. So I'll pull the gathers together very quickly. The nice thing about working with a lightweight fabric like this is it's very, very easy to pull the gathers together. So we go from here to the notch, and we match this up. Mine are a little tight, but not a problem. Nothing's been sewn in, so we can just let that out a little. Match that notch to here. Pin that in. Distribute our gathering stitches a little bit better. Now, we have all of these gathering stitches, and this small area here from where we sewed these two seams together, we have a small area here where all of these gathering stitches will come into. So I'll pull those together. And these gathering stitches will definitely be very tight because there's a lot going into a very small area. So now we have these stitches gathered up. But before we pin that in, what we need to do is there is a tie here that comes out of that little small area where all of those gathers went in, and it's our short tie. There are two ties with the pattern, a long tie that starts on the side seam and then it wraps around to the other side and ties, and the little short tie. So before we pin all of that together, we want to slide our tie in here. And then pin that in place. It can be just a little bit fiddly, but in the end, it's worth it. So I have it all pinned into place, and now what you would do is sew straight across here. Very straightforward, just a nice straight seam. And then I can show you from the outside what it's going to look like. Of course, this has not been sewn in. I have pins and everything, but you get a good idea that pin my pleat in at the neckline. So my pleat is across my front. All of my gathers are in here, and because of all the curves that were in this pattern piece, what happens now is here with this tie, And what makes this lovely swoop of drapes is this tie actually turns. So here you can see it straight. See that straight across seam, and then here is where it turns, and that's what gives you all the lovely drapes. So it is a little intimidating. It takes just a minute or two to figure it out, but in the end it's well worth it.